and a very good evening to you, and you're welcome to another edition of the GreenZone Conversations with Eugene Doyle. Tonight, I want to thank you for joining us, and we're also going to examine one of the most controversial public policy debates currently taking place in Ireland. This programme is not about questioning the dignity or humanity of any individual. Every person deserves to be treated with respect. Instead, tonight, we're examining the law, public policy, children's rights, parental responsibility, medical ethics, and the role of the state. Should the Irish taxpayer fund gender transition services, and especially for minors? Should legal gender recognition be available to anyone under 18 years of age? Should Parliament set clear legal boundaries, or should policy continue to evolve through the courts? Government policy and clinical guidance as well. Supporters of a more cautious approach argue that Irish law already recognises that children cannot make many altering legal decisions. They cannot vote. They cannot purchase alcohol or tobacco. They cannot gamble. They cannot obtain tattoos. They cannot enter many legally binding contracts. They argue that decisions relating to gender transition should be treated with, at the very least, the same level of caution. They also point to the fact that the government itself continues to review the scientific evidence before introducing a permanent national model of care, suggesting that this remains an evolving field of medicine. Others disagree. They argue that timely recognition and appropriate healthcare are essential for the well-being of transgender young people, and the unnecessary legal or medical barriers may cause harm. Tonight, we'll examine these competing perspectives respectfully and ask whether Ireland is striking the right balance between protecting vulnerable young people, respecting families, following the evidence, and safeguarding the public interest. I'm delighted to welcome our special guest tonight, Laoise de Brún BL, who's a barrister, broadcast journalist, and international board-certified lactation consultant. She is the founder of The Countess, Ireland's only centre-right social policy think tank. She has become one of Ireland's best-known campaigners on gender policy, immigration, and family protection. She has drafted legislative proposals concerning gender recognition and prisons. She also founded the Women's Coalition on Immigration and has represented clients challenging state policy before domestic and international bodies. Joining us also once again live from Jerusalem is our regular GreenZone panelist, interpreter, tour guide of the Holy Land, and co-producer of the GreenZone, Marco Alexander. Laoise and Marco, you are both very welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Eugene.
Delighted to be here.
Laoise, can I start with you and just ask you, just to give our listeners a flavour of who Laoise de Brún is, tell us a little bit about the Countess, because the Countess was not a simple thing to set up. You faced a lot of barriers. Tell us a bit about the Countess and what challenges that you had to go through to get it set up.
So in terms of the sort of origin story of the Countess, what happened was I was still living in London, and a group of lesbians called Get the L Out, meaning they wanted the L to be removed from LGBTQ, etc., etc. And they had a protest whereby they lay down on the ground ahead of the Pride parade during London Pride. And so the march couldn't start. And this was on live television. I remember watching it on BBC London. And Sadiq Khan, who was then the mayor in 2018 and still is the mayor, made a statement. And the statement said, "There's no room for hate in London Pride." And as a journalist, something dawned on me. I just had this download where I was like, hate? That doesn't seem very hateful. It seemed quite gentle. It seemed quite almost Gandhi-esque. And then the other thing was, why didn't they just ask the lesbians why they were protesting? And then there was the visual juxtaposition of these elderly ladies with white hair, with kind of battered denim jackets, very much like the lineage who'd been to, Greenham Common, or they just look like the real deal. And they had hand-daubed cardboard posters. And they said things like the cotton ceiling is rape culture. And I didn't know what that meant, but I remember the camera panning around and it showed just a sea of young men, you know, a lot of them topless, like Haydeness. And then behind all these young guys were the corporate sponsors of Pride, like Goldman Sachs and HSBC. And I remember thinking, something isn't right here. Something's just not tallying. And so I decided to consciously go onto Twitter, where I knew the conversation was being had. And I followed various thought leaders. And I'll never forget it. And a lot of activists will have the same story, whereby, you know, you don't really sleep for 2 weeks and you're just reading and trying to work it all out and joining the dots. And then when you eventually do join the dots, it's existential. It's like you climb out of a bunker and you're like, oh my God, this thing is everywhere. Like, it impacts every part of life. It's in our schools. It's impacting prisons. They're sending men to female prison, into female cells. They're, you know, it's female sport. It's a category of sex and sport. Like, everything that my foremothers fought for, all of those fundamental rights and our values are being threatened and in many ways trampled on and destroyed. And there was a huge issue for child protection as well. So I kind of joined the dots. And my first hard lesson as an activist was trying to tell everyone, you know, you really want to tell the culture. And you realize very early on, the culture doesn't want to know. There's such a huge amount of brainwashing and propaganda, and there's an official narrative around this issue that's been carefully curated in the media. Now, one thing that was very obvious at the time to me was in London, due to the size of London as a global city and the kind of the discourse there, it's quite discordant anyway. People are very free with their opinions. So everyone was talking about it and maybe disagreeing with me. I was talking about it all the time. And then fast forward to a Six Nations match, and I came home for that with my husband. And I was sat at a table with very close friends of ours, our children's godparents. And I said, did you know we have full gender self-ID in Ireland? Do you know what that means? Any man can fill out a form. They just have to get it notarized and they get sent to the female prison. And we're already sending men to female prison. And everyone just went and looked horrified and just looked at the table and just said nothing. And in that moment, I said, I'm going to have to organize. I'm going to become an organizer. I had read Obama's book. I didn't know what organizing meant, but I thought, that's what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to have to set up something, set up a group. So that was the catalyst, the fact that no one would even proffer an opinion one way or the other in Ireland. So then I tried to find people who were like-minded on Twitter. I set up a secret Twitter group. It was really hard to find people because this was before Elon Musk bought Twitter, now X. So like if you expressed gender critical views, as they're called, basically, you know, saying that sex is real and binary and you cannot change sex and a man can't become a woman, all these things we all know, everyone knows are true. Even the hardcore leftists know this is true. But you could be suspended. So people were terrified of being doxxed, which means when they put out your real name, you know, if you operate under an alias or an avatar. So it's very hard to find people, but bit by bit it grew. And then by that summer, I started Zooming and I had like a series of Zooms. And the one thing I did from the get-go, I don't really know how I knew to do this, but maybe it's my journalism background, probably. I was like very clear that we were going to scope really, really hard at the beginning. Like, what do we want? What's the objective? What is the goal? What language will we use? Will we say the word trans woman? Will we say trans woman? Or will we say trans-identified, you know, male? And so we decided early on, I said, I'm never going to use the word trans women. And also I said, we're never going to attack any person. We're not even going to name people. We're not going to tag anyone. It's only going to be policy. And so what happens is when you start up a group, you know, initially you do attract a lot of kind of, as we say in Ireland, head the balls. You know, that's the nature of activism. But if you keep doing policy as we do, we've always done a lot of policy work. By that, I mean all the submissions, you know, all the consultations. We've presented to the UN 3 times now. So like we do a lot of, we're policy heavy. And so then naturally people who wanted to sort of chain themselves to the railing, they just drift off. And so that's why we've lasted and grown and evolved so much, So that's kind of the beginning. And the reason we got the name was because I just felt that Ireland was only 100 years old, and we were so dirt poor as a new country. We couldn't really build a state, so we kind of handed the keys, as we know, to various religious orders, which in many ways was a great thing because they did bring forth a huge revolution in public health and education. But it meant that we didn't really build these institutions ourselves as a country. And then when we kind of, because of various issues that occurred, when that influence waned and we wrestled the keys from the Catholic Church, let's say, we just handed that to 34,000 NGOs, who are now all hard left and who are pumping, these radical progressive policies like gender self-ID into Ireland. And I just felt I'm quite patriotic. I call myself a small R Republican, and I always revered Countess Markievicz, and I felt her vision of a republic, like all those visionaries, has never been realized. The country's kind of been managed and run, and then managed and run, and now I would see it as kind of been sold from underneath our feet, really. So that's why it's called. The long name is The Countess Didn't Fight for This, meaning 100 years later, this is not what those men and women fought for.
And particularly Countess Markievicz.
Yeah.
Very, very good name, actually.
Yeah.
Now, just before I go on, I just want to, for our viewers, just to remind them to please subscribe to the channel because we can bring you more interesting content as we go forward. And I'd also like anyone who hears anything on or sees anything on the program tonight and wants to get involved, please comment and drop your comment in the question in the chat. We'll put it up here for Laoise and indeed Marco, and we'll answer your question as best we can. And then the other thing I would ask you to do is just to share the podcast with your friends, friends, family, whatever. Just share it. That'd be great. Just 3 small things I'd ask you to do. So thank you for that. Now, Laoise, just back to you there. So the other thing that a lot of people wouldn't know is that the recent referendums where the family was going to be redefined and the mother was going to be taken out of the Constitution, that lost by in around 74%. It was defeated, massively defeated. And this is probably testament to why the likes of us is on this platform now, is bringing an alternative opinion, because people were getting an opinion just on one side of it, really. But you had a big part in the defeat of those referendums, hadn't you?
Yes, quite early on, when I read the constitutional amendments that were proposed by the government, I was just horrified. And I mean, I am a feminist to my bones, but I would see myself as a mother first and foremost, really. And there's a whole new strain of feminism, which is very much more about maternity and caring. And when I read Article 41.2, I just felt it was a beautiful recognition of what I do at home. That is certainly not parenting or caring or fathering. It's mothering. And mothering is a unique biological function without which I don't think humanity would have survived, because there's a ferocity and a mammalian element to mothering that is so often overlooked. There's a huge biological element to it. I talk about this a lot in my campaigning against surrogacy, which overlaps with this, because surrogacy, after all, is, it's a real visceral attack on what motherhood is and on that proto relationship that starts in utero. But and I'll come back to this in a moment, but I think it's no coincidence whatsoever that they first had to remove this recognition of the mother from our constitution, and then very soon afterwards try to bring in surrogacy, because you have to, in order to make the case for surrogacy, you have to be able to say that motherhood and mothering is replaceable and disposable and interchangeable. Sorry, there's a little person sneaking in.
That's
Gives it a
okay.
bit of authenticity, gives it more.
But the thing is, with the referendum, you know, what we were told by the state, by both parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, by the so-called opposition, Sinn Féin, and by all of the NGOs, except I think one or two notable exceptions, was that this was a really old-fashioned, retrograde article in our constitution, and it was holding us back. And if only we could remove this old-fashioned language. You know, I did a lot of thinking about it and reading about it, writing about it, and kind of what our campaign was basically was this, that, you know, the government is insulting us by saying that if we remove this old-fashioned language, which was what the UN had said they needed Ireland to do, it came from CEDAW. This was a demand from a UN committee, and they basically were saying this is, you know, according to their metrics, Irish women were kind of being held back by this discriminatory and stereotyping of the gender roles. So there's a few things there that really annoyed me at the time. Firstly, this kind of lazy intellectual approach that if we take out this language, which is, you know, it's very paternalistic. It sort of says she shouldn't, her duties in the home shouldn't be neglected. You know, that is kind of annoying. But the rest of it is so beautiful and so radical. And I would even argue quite socialist, because it actually says that you shouldn't have to go out and work for economic necessity. The state should provide for you to be at home with your children. And the thing that I love most about it is it says that that because of a work within the home, the common good, the state recognizes for the work done in the home, without which the common good cannot be achieved. And at the time, I just thought, tell me an instance in the whole world, or in any country, or in, you know, in anyone's history, where a state body has recognized what women are doing in the home, which we know we do. We know what it is that we do when we have all this, you know, it's unpaid labor. And then I looked at the stats, and like Irish women are still doing like double the amount of hours unpaid labor in the home as, say, Danish women, you know, a huge amount more than men, and very much at the bottom in terms of the equality in terms of across Europe. But none of that really matters, because what they were trying to say was, we're not going to help you with any of this. We're just going to remove this old-fashioned language, because it's the language that's holding you back. It's not the structural reality of your life, firstly. And there was this idea, which I just found so irritating, that like, we'll take away this language, and then somehow Ireland will just be, you know, will just be kind of propelled from its old Catholic past to some wormhole and end up in Scandinavia, which is where we always should try and be. Like, that is just obviously a fallacy, but also this idea that the beautiful recognition that's there, and in that recognition, it's not just a nice thing to read and to see. There are constitutional rights that reside in that article. So there's a few different layers to it. And I was just like, no, this is not going to happen. They're not going to do this. How dare they? How dare they insult us? So we just launched a campaign based on those kind of 3 points. Basically, that it was a beautiful recognition. It was from the state to us, that women so often aren't thanked for what they do as mothers. But at least these, you know, the men who drafted the 1937 Constitution, like, I think, you know, I was kind of raised to think that's the past, and those men almost hated women. But now I see it as completely the opposite, that it was those conservative, paternalistic men who really revered motherhood. And in fact, when you read into it, as I have done, one of the reasons De Valera wanted what was called then the maternity clause in the Constitution was because he was raised in, it was called a foundling, or in an orphanage, basically in New York. And he was really keen that mothers would have, would be elevated, that motherhood would be elevated officially by the state. And there's actually, it's called the Zurich draft, because I've gone deep into this. Actually, this wasn't part of our campaign. I'm just interested in it. And it goes further, and it says that the state will basically financially support families to have big families, you know, so it goes even beyond what we ended up with. And I think that's fascinating, and I'd love to see that happening today. Obviously, our birth rate is not at replacement anymore. We're at 1.47. I think that's hugely concerning. It's not really talked about in Ireland. But like, the thing that's concerning about the birth rate, or frustrating for me, is that like, I speak at conferences. I spoke at one recently in Budapest about family formation. And you're surrounded by people all from all over Europe. But in those countries, they were at like 2 or 3 children in the 60s. But like in Ireland, you're talking about one generation ago, we had huge families. You know, like when I was in school in the 80s and 90s, kind of everyone seemed to come from families of 4 or 5. So it's purely this idea that, you know, being a mother is not as honored anymore. It's not seen as a woman's birthright. It's not valued as much, I think, in the culture and in society. And this is what Tucker Carlson picked up on. Actually, I did an interview with him on it at the time, and he was like, you know, this idea that you just get out there and work. That's what equality is. That's how you'll be free. That's how you'll be happy. Versus being at home with your small children. Like in reality, over 80% of women want to be mothers, and in reality, you know, between 80 and 90% want to be home with their small children. And that is simply a fact. But official feminism, and dare I say state feminism, because the NGOs that are feminist NGOs that are funded by the state, they will not tell you that. They will not tell you that. So when people blame feminism for everything, I don't think it's feminism. I think it's corporate capitalism, because it's not in the interest of mothers and women and their children to get them out to work, you know, for 12 hours, leave your baby in the creche, get them up at 6. Like that is not serving women and mothers. So I think that feminism is a useful smokescreen that the state and that the and that essentially capitalism use, and they've indoctrinated young women into this idea that that's the only way, like that it almost like it's beneath them to be at home potty training when you could be out making money, you know. And I think that's sad.
And Laoise, how did we get here? I mean, is it when the church scandals, the sex scandals in the church, or the paedophilia in the church, is that when this all started? That we have just, like, we have literally gone like a bullet train in all areas of social policy, whether it's redefining what marriage is, whether it's trying to remove the mother from the Constitution, trying to change the definition of the family, immigration, when we don't want to talk about the increasing the birth rate naturally here ourselves. We might be using immigration to replace that. How did we get here, in your opinion, Laoise?
I think you're right insofar as the church sexual abuse scandals, whilst they happened in other countries, I think they hit Ireland hard in a very visceral way. I think they were so badly managed in terms of predators being moved around and around and around, the secrecy around it. And I think the sense of betrayal was as severe as it was, because people had been so universally, globally, you know, adherent, and it was such a part of the social fabric. As I said, like, I remember universal mass attendance in the 90s. That's not very long ago at all. There's an amazing book, Best Catholics in the World, which I really suggest people read, by Derek Scally. He's the Irish Times Berlin correspondent. And he looks in this issue about, you know, like, everyone went to mass, but did everyone really believe? Like, was it just about being respectable? It's about this Irish sense of respectability, being seen to be doing the right thing. And I think he's onto something there. I think there's a huge element of post-colonialism, of self-policing, of, you know, who are the respectable people. And I think that we think, and we tell ourselves we've shaken this all off, and we've walked kind of boldly into the light, and we're all progressives now. But I argue the opposite, that we've stayed exactly the same, and we've just taken on a whole new dogma and a whole new, you know, theoretical framework. So the kind of God of trans, the God of mass immigration, of climate, even, you know, all these things there's an orthodoxy around them, and they're so policed socially by the media, by government, and there's a huge, almost emotional element to it. You know, you hear words like "you're a disgrace," or, you know, why would you want to be associated with those sorts of people? And I just see the same thing happening again. Like, I think that, like, I went on to something. This is a good example, okay? I was on Instagram recently, and I have a private account, but I said something about this woman had written this poem after the murder of the American girl by the Palestinian, you know, / Jordanian refugee in Ireland. Sorry, I can't remember her name, Jamie. And anyway, this woman wrote a poem, but it was all about, you know, the usual thing, like all men, it's not brown men, it's not black men, it's not brown men, it's all men. And I just thought, for once, I'm going to say something. So I said, yes, we all know there's an issue with femicide and male violence against women and girls in Ireland. But what about if we're importing? Are we not concerned? Should we not call out the fact that if we're importing another layer of male violence because of cultural differences? And within minutes, I was threatened with, they were going to go to the Law Society and report me to try and get me fired, and they were going to dox me. And that's what I mean about this kind of, like, those people would have been the ones rounding up pregnant girls and putting them in mother and baby homes, because it's the same instinct.
Yeah. And is the Leisha, is the government and mainstream media this loosely use of far right, is that used in your opinion to close down conversation of the other side?
Yeah, and I think it works. It has been working, but it's having less and less of an impact. But the government and the kind of media in Ireland, which is essentially their client, it's like a client media, they know very well how to pull that lever of shame, and they know how well it works on the Irish psyche. And that's going back to my earlier point about how I noticed the difference about people holding opinions here. It's very policed in Ireland. There seems to be one acceptable opinion at a time. That's probably to do with the size of our country, but it's also to do with the history of our country. I think there's an element, this post-colonial element of self-policing, you know. Even the thing about notions, like other countries don't have any, there's no idea that if you display your wealth and your success, therefore you have to be taken down a peg or two. Like, that just doesn't exist in other countries. So I think when they call us far right, they know what they're doing. I think when far right was redefined to include anyone who disagrees with government, anyone who's anti-immigration, versus being someone who was a proto-fascist or a neo-Nazi, like, we know what far right means, but they have redefined far right and expanded it and collapsed it to mean anyone who dissents, really.
Or has an alternative opinion.
Yeah. Like, and I think, unfortunately for us, you know, a lot of this it's actually really all coming downstream from the European Union. And the European Union has the power and the clout to build, as it has done, a whole architecture of censorship, and to criminalize, as it is trying to constantly all the time, and has managed to a degree to criminalize dissent. So when we transposed the Council Framework 2008 on combating racism and xenophobia, we went further than we were asked to do in terms of transposing it and creating hate crime laws. We amended 10 different offences that were already on our statute books. We did fight them, and we kind of fought back and said we're not going to transpose the hate speech element. And that was one of our early campaigns. We fought that since 22, I think. But unfortunately, they've brought it in now to the back door, because there's other laws that are being used to criminalize dissent. For example, Coco's law, malicious communications. So what we're seeing, actually, if we take a step back, is that coming downstream from Europe, it's the same thing that's happening in Ireland. So it's like the micro and the macro. So in Ireland, we have NGOs funded by the taxpayer, like forcing really deeply unpopular, anti-human, anti-family, anti-mother anti-prosperity laws onto the people against their will, without a mandate, without consensus, without consent, without any voting.
And do you think?
But they're doing that at the European level as well. So it's NGOs that are really drafting those bills at the commission level, and then we end up having to transpose them. And 80% of our laws come directly from Europe now anyway. We literally just cut and paste.
And Alicia, do you think that the funding, the amount of funding that taxpayers are given to NGOs in Ireland, do you think the public are aware of that?
See, I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you two think about this. Like, I think increasingly in Ireland, it feels to me like there's two alternate realities, and one of them is the people who are only getting their news and culture and kind of vibes from mainstream media and from the official narrative. And the other side are people who are reading all the sources, coming up with their own, drawing their own conclusions. And as someone who lives in the latter half, I find it wild that you can have all the information that exists in the whole world in this, and you've no curiosity. And I've come to the conclusion that I've obviously become a campaigner, so I feel completely compelled and driven to do this. But most people are too busy. But also they're well able to compartmentalize it. They don't want to, disrupt their lives. And I think also they don't want the cognitive dissonance. They don't want to think, has the government lied to me? Am I being manipulated? Is RT telling me something that's not true? Is RT leaving things out that I should know about? They don't want to deal with that cognitive dissonance. Because we live it, and we know it's a heavy load sometimes.
Okay, and Henrietta just sends in a text there. Hello, Eugene, Marco, and Alicia. Do you not think also due to living costs that families are downscaling in big families due to rising costs? It is therefore they both need to work to survive. But that's very, very true, Henrietta. They do now need to work. Everyone needs to work now to pay mortgages and as you say, cost of living crisis. Marco,
can I just pick up on that, Eugene, that last comment, because that's a very interesting comment. And I think that what happens here in Israel actually runs counter to that, because the cost of living here is extremely high, yet people have many children. People go against the trend in the Western world here. So I can give you a case study where, for example, when in the late 80s and 90s, Jews were coming to Israel from Russia. They were immigrating from Russia when the gates had been opened. Now in Russia, usually had about one child per family. Once they came here, they were having 3, 4, 5 children, even when they were from secular families. So in reality, I don't believe it's due to the cost of living. It's due to a world view. That's my opinion. To have a sense of certain values in place, if you will. That's not to say that the cost of living can't influence, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's when people have a sense of something that they need to transmit to other people, namely that they inherited something from their parents and that they are the custodians of something, and that something needs to be transmitted to further generations. And in this sense, I'm very much a Burkean. I cite the great Irish philosopher Edmund Burke when he spoke about the nation, something that we are the custodians of, something that we must keep, treasure, and transmit to future generations. So at the end of the day, I believe it's a matter of mentality. And I think we touch on another very important point, I suppose, is the erosion of identity. And erosion in identity in Western Europe. What is the word religio mean? To tie people together in Latin. What is it that bound people together? And in Europe, the only thing that binds people together, essentially speaking, from Ireland to Italy, is the traditional religious sense. Now, once that is dissolved, then the whole system goes at the end of the day. And what we've seen in recent years is that whole conceptual framework of morality and values which has been eroded, and we're now seeing the attendant results. So much so, and I think it's very important to remember the EU, when the constitution was proposed to the EU that it should incorporate Judeo-Christian values, this was turned down. And this is symptomatic of the type of impositions which we are witnessing now from the EU, which subverts traditional values. But I think, people are beginning to wake up, but because there's only so much you can take, because once you erode the moral categories, as we've seen, you have a sort of a collective madness and disorientation which is setting in, and now you're seeing a counter reaction all over Europe.
And before I go back to Laoise, Marco, just picking up on what Laoise has been saying, Ireland is a very different Ireland than when you were here, and you were here up to maybe 19 or 20. And I assume, I'm sure it's doesn't shock you to see it, but I'd say it saddens you to see.
It certainly saddens me to see that a country which fought so valiantly for its independence and to reacquire its sense of identity is throwing it away, as it were. I'm not speaking on you people are more au fait with what's happening on the ground, but certainly at an institutional level, when I hear certain politicians speak, and I believe the Taoiseach, I saw a recent video of the Taoiseach saying that sovereignty was an outdated thing, that is symptomatic of a country that is surrendering something very important, and that it doesn't want to hand to future generations.
Laoise, do you want to pick up on that before?
Yes, just to quickly comment on the viewer's question, I think she's absolutely right. And there's a specific policy I would point to, which was tax individualization, which was brought in, I mean, shockingly recently. It was 2000 it was brought in by Charlie McCreevy, the then Minister for Finance. And at the time, you look at the Dáil debates, like there was huge awareness this was going to end the traditional family. This was going to harm. This was an attack on the family. And at the time, the government was completely blatant, open, like explicitly saying we want to force women into the workforce. And so you can trace the birth rate, the declining birth rate, from a time when most women did not work full-time. A huge number didn't work at all outside the home, and those who did had part-time jobs. And as a mother of 3 myself, it is just not something that you can stomach if you have to work full-time and you have to leave the house on the clock every morning and work like a man, essentially demanding of women that they are men and work like men, while still asking them to mother. Because as I said earlier, mothering is not fathering. If a child is sick, it will still be the mother who takes the day off work. There was a recent snow day in Ireland, and I mean, the figures were just so reflective of reality versus what the kind of left would talk about in terms of what they think should happen. Like, it was like 90% of the workers who took the day off were women and the rest were grandmothers, like it was insane. So that's the reality of mothering. So you're just not going to have more than 1 or 2 children, or if you have any at all, compared to what we used to have.
Yeah, what do you say, Laoise, then to the Liberals who say men should be able to do this job that mothers are doing?
Well, they won't do it ahead of their careers. It doesn't seem that is, because they could have done that. Do you know what I mean? Like, look at the snow day. Why did the mums all stay home and not the dads, when currently most mothers in Ireland do work full time?
And are we trying to pretend that there is that the relationship between a mother and the child is completely different than the relationship between a father and a child? Are we trying to forget that?
I think we are, and I think that there's a huge drive to strip that from our culture and from our collective consciousness. And to me, the mother-baby relationship is sacred. Motherhood is sacred. I'm a lactation consultant, and I always talk about this. Like, we know instinctively, like, it's common sense, and everyone knows this, the bond between the mother and their child, and it's lifelong. but they've just recently found out that if you carry a baby, the cells, the baby, you will have stem cells from that baby in your body forever, and vice versa. So the bond that we talk about, that we all are aware of, that's the scientific explanation for it. And offering children a secure attachment, like that's done by the mother. It's done in infancy, and it's because the mother is responsive, emotionally responsive. So it's much harder to be emotionally responsive if you're not there. If the child is with some, someone, a care worker in a nursery, and there's a lot of new thinking about this on the right, but it's just saying what we all know anyway. I just think that it's really hard on mothers and children to demand of mothers to work like men and still, try and raise families. Like, it's so obvious that that's why the birth rate is declining. Also, possibly as well, to Marco's point, I think we all know that in the height of the power of the Catholic Church in Ireland, women were definitely encouraged to have 7 children. Without doubt, of course they were. That's why everyone's parents come from families of 7. So there was definitely a kind of, like what Marco was saying, there was a kind of a drive there. It was seen as an idealistic or like a value-laden endeavor. It was good. You were closer to God the more children you had. Yeah. That's definitely gone. That doesn't exist at all anymore.
But the natural thing there, Laoise, was that if you had 7 children, the natural thing was that you looked after the children as the mother when they were young, and that they would be there to look after you when you became old and frail or whatever like that, to help you. Isn't that part of what the thinking was?
So I have to give credit to my good friend Barbara McCarthy, and she's a founding member of the Women's Coalition on Immigration. She wrote a really scathing piece for Gript recently, and she said exactly that. She said, all these people sipping their, having their avocados on toast and sipping their iced frappuccinos, who's going to mind them? If they don't get married and have children, who's going to take their bottles to the bottle bank? Because I do that for my parents. Everyone does that. Everyone helps their elderly parents. Who's going to help them? And the idea seems to be that we're going to import all these healthcare workers from Africa, and they're going to look after us when we're frail and vulnerable. I'm not saying, and I don't want to besmirch any kind of nation or anything, or race. Not, of course not. But obviously, if you've come here and you've left children behind in Nigeria in order to make money, and you're here on a visa, it's just not going to be the same thing as if you grew up in the area and the person's family, that you're looking after them, you're looking after their mother. It's just a whole different proposition. And it concerns me. We are witnessing the breakdown of the family, and I think nobody is taking it seriously.
No. And if our viewers, I know they're waiting for us to get onto the gender, and we are going to get onto it now, but this is to show that the social policy in Ireland in so many areas is part of this web of forced change in Ireland. And let's move to that. Laoise, the gender. Tell me, what was the original purpose of the gender recognition legislation? And we did come here again like a bullet train. This gender thing hit us like something between the 2 eyes as well, did it not?
Yeah. So it's kind of a typical Irish story legislatively, insofar as, we sort of dragged our feet for 10 years and then we totally overcorrected. And the reason we did bring in gender self-ID in the first instance was because 2 test cases. One is the Irish one with Lydia Foy, and that was the Irish one. But there was also a UK one that went to Europe, and obviously European law is superior. We have to follow it. We have to follow those decisions and those apex decisions. So there was a test case called the Goodwin case, where essentially the court said that they had to find a way to assuage the distress of what they viewed to be kind of a third sex, or, people that were sort of trapped, or they were in the views of the eyes of the court, they were passing as female, but their official government document said male. So it was fought on 2 heads, privacy and the right to marry. And the right to marry becomes moot once same-sex marriage is brought in Europe. So then it was on the right to privacy. And the idea was that, you know, if they were stopped and they were asked to show their driver's license, and it would cause them so much distress if they looked like a woman, but their driver's license said male. And that was how narrow the scope was. But unfortunately, you know, and similarly, the Foy case, it was a similar thing. It was about he wanted his birth cert changed to say woman, not man, or female, not male. And he lost at first instance, and it's a High Court decision with McKechnie, Judge McKechnie, who says he's concerned about the impact on women and children. And he also says that one's birth cert is not like a passport. It's not like a document that shows one's travels through life. And he says also in his judgment that it's in the interest of the state to keep correct birth records. So he makes those 3 points. And I think those 3 points are really the basis of the argument against gender self-ID to this day. But unfortunately, it was because of the Goodwin decision that came downstream from Europe, it had to be, there was a case stated where they reopened that decision. And then they had to basically bring in legislation. So they were told to bring in legislation. The legislation was to just simply for that narrow scope. So the right to marry is at this point is moot. So it's been dealt with already, because obviously same-sex people can marry by now. So they don't have to worry about that. So it's just right to privacy in terms of your documentation. But unfortunately, what happens in Ireland, they go way beyond that, and they bring in a really radical mechanism called like full gender self-ID. So they had put together this review group who had suggested the medical model. And the medical model does allow you to change your documents, but there's a whole process where you have to go, like you're supervised by your GP. You have to go before a panel of doctors and lawyers. It depends from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that's typically is how it's run. It takes about 2 years. So there's an element of it being supervised. There's an element of it there being kind of checks and balances, you know, making sure people aren't mentally unwell or fetishist or predators. Now, it's not perfect by any means. And I would say it's still ontologically, it's an attack on women, because I think as a woman, it's an insult to me to say that a man, even with surgery, is a woman, or even with, you know, a lot of distress or dysphoria, is a woman. However, at least there was some element of restraint to it. But in Ireland, we went beyond that. So initially that was what was proposed. That was the bill that was making its way through the houses of the Oireachtas. And then at the very last minute, there was a switch made in a joint Oireachtas committee by only 5 deputies. And they switched from the medical model to full gender self-ID. And full gender self-ID means that you can just fill out a form and you don't have to take any drugs. You don't have to do any surgery. You don't have to have an intention of taking any drugs or doing any surgery. So either of you, Marco and Eugene, can literally just fill out a form, get it notarized, and then you are given a gender recognition certificate. There is no supervisory body. Nobody is, you know.
And how does that apply to?
There's no safeguarding. There's no checks.
And is there safeguarding in relation to children in relation to this?
So it's 18 and above, and age 16 and 17, you have to go through the courts.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So basically, that's why you ended up in a situation, which is why I founded the Countess in the first instance, was because a very dangerous, homicidal, psychopathic man was sent to the women's wing of Limerick Prison. His name is Barbie Kardashian, and he's so dangerous and violent that his own mother was on the run. And then you had this farcical scenario where the Gardaí were saying, you know, a woman was on the run. A bit like the current situation with regard to the main suspect in the murder in Killarney, where they said we can't put out his description or his name or his picture because of the current laws about identifying asylum seekers. So you're looking at in real time how there's a sacred caste, you know, and how they're treated differently and have special rights. So essentially, yes, in Ireland we have the most radical, the most permissive gender self-ID laws in the world. There's only a handful of jurisdictions that have something like us. And I don't think people are really even aware of it. I think they've really been managed so carefully by the media. They think, oh, sure, God help them. Why wouldn't he help them? And, you know, they really suffered and they're really suffering. And they're encouraged to look at it in the first person, like first person accounts. They're not encouraged to look at the policy ramifications at all.
Marco, what do you make of what you're hearing? Is Ireland on its own here, or are we looking at this elsewhere that you're aware of?
No, Ireland is very much part of a Europe-wide phenomenon. Probably Ireland played catch-up and probably went beyond, but certainly Laoise knows more about that than I do. But certainly Ireland is not an isolated case. This, to a great extent, has been imported. As we mentioned before, the void has been left by the dissipation of Christianity in Ireland. And whether people were religious or not, at least there was this Pavlovian, let's say, reflex Christianity that existed. That has been further eroded, and this presents certainly fertile ground for these curious views to insinuate themselves within Irish society. But Ireland isn't isolated. It's probably going above and beyond perhaps of what is required. But Laoise certainly knows more than I do about that.
And Laoise, just in relation to you're telling us what is currently the situation. What, in your opinion, should we really be doing in relation to gender recognition? Whether taxpayers' money should be used for gender reconstruction, used in minors as well. What way should the law be in relation to this?
There are only two sexes, and sex is binary and immutable, and everything else should be dealt with through a robust, compassionate, caring mental health theoretical framework. Okay. I mean, it's that simple. Even if you look at the outcomes of surgery and amongst an adult cohort, I mean, it's horrific. Like the rates of incontinence after what's known as bottom surgery is like 70-80%. I mean, it's just, nobody should be butchering their bodies to deal with what essentially is mental, psychiatric anguish and distress. And I'm not taking from that. But there's been very few times in the history of humanity where we have successfully, in a clinical setting, solved psychiatric issues with surgery.
And is there a case here of what's happening here is that no one wants anyone to be discriminated on with having mental health issues. So this is no longer a mental health issue. This is something that this person wants to be, and we don't want to deal with it. We can't have people discriminating people because of a mental health, and we just won't class it as that anymore. Is that too simplistic, or is it? Is there part reality?
No. You're totally on the money, because that's what did happen. It was redefined in the DSM handbook. Like, there's a few things to say about this. Like, one theory is that, you know, I mean, I think it's blatantly obvious that this is not a grassroots movement. This is not like gay rights. People have not marched and fought and reached a kind of painful consensus out loud in the public over many, many decades. It's not like that at all. It's come from nowhere. It's come top down. And I view it very much as the kind of pet project or side project of transhumanism. In order to accept transhumanism, we have to first be persuaded to completely collapse the sex binary. And I think that's the big missing piece that people miss. They get caught up on whether or not it's right or wrong. They think about it in terms of an orientation, like being gay, straight, or bisexual, when it's not. I mean, it isn't even a community. Like a young girl who's covered in self-harm scars from taking a blade to her wrists because she's so traumatized by whether that's, you know, sexual abuse or rape, or it could be just a lack of attachment at home and a very bad divorce. It could be any number of things. But there is a cohort of young girls who are identifying as non-binary or as male. And that has risen exponentially. Like, before the dawn of the iPhone in 2010, there was no known clinical case of that phenomenon. But those girls have much more in common with the girls through the ages, the 15 and 16-year-olds, who have always managed to transmit their collective psychic distress. Teenage girls do that. That's what they do. So there's a huge element of contagion. They have nothing in common with the autogynephile, what we used to call a transvestite, a man who basically gets aroused by wearing female clothes and likes to think of himself as a woman. Those two people have nothing in common, but they've been bunched together under the kind of umbrella of trans. I would argue that the fetishist needs the trans child in order to give credence to this idea that it is innate, that everyone has a gender identity. And because everyone has a gender identity and they're born with one, therefore we have to protect it. Like, had those men just come out and said, you know what, I get really aroused when I go into female spaces and when I think of myself as a woman, so I'm demanding this right from you, from the majority, everyone would have said no. But instead, if they said, which they did do, it was a very successful sleight of hand. It was a masterclass in advocacy, really. What they said was, I am a minority and I'm highly distressed and vulnerable. And inside me is a lifelong, deep inner knowing that I am actually a woman. And I've no choice about this. And it's my human right to identify as a woman. I need to be who I truly am. Otherwise, I'm oppressed, and you, good progressive person, you, good liberal, you give me what I want. So they completely mangled what was really happening. And they've brought a whole swathe of young people who are already confused and distressed with them. And I feel for me, that's the unforgivable element of this, that so many young girls in particular, and young boys, have just been grist to the mill. Their bodies will never, ever recover. They've done irreversible harm to their bodies. And it's not just the reproductive element where they will be not only infertile, but sterile for life. They'll never have an orgasm. It's also the fact that during puberty, natural, normal, biological puberty, your brain goes through a synapses. So you rewire, and that's how you end up with a faculty for critical thinking. That's how you end up with a proper adult developed temporal lobe. And they don't have that. So I think there's layers to this, and I think often we're only drip fed the most basic layer. Clearly there's a huge impact on women's rights and child safeguarding. For me, like, it's just the new wave of misogyny. Like, men in dresses are the new misogynists. Like, there's a gleefulness, which sort of men do you definitely not want in women's spaces? Well, it's the men who will go into those spaces regardless of how it makes the women feel, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because any decent man does not want to be in a female toilet. They don't want to scare women. They don't want to prey on women or creep women out. They also don't want to compete against women on the track and field in sports. Like, where's the glory in that? These are not good men. These are not decent, good men and boys. They're the wrong sorts that are being encouraged through their narcissism and through society to transgress these fundamental boundaries and borders that keep women and girls safe and give us equality.
Now, I read, I listened to one of your talks somewhere here in Ireland, and I'm paraphrasing this. Just going back to the speed in which we're able to do things in this country, and correct me if I have it wrong, but I think you said that in Ireland, we speak about one subject at a time. And this is how they make progress so quickly. That we're not thinking about loads of things at the same time. I may have that wrong, but I think it's something that struck me. It struck me when I was looking at your piece. That struck me as very, very important as to what's actually happening in Ireland.
Yeah, like I always say, and it's maybe a little bit facetious, but it's not meant to be. I always say we've segued from one theocracy to the next. So, there was one way of living and seeing the world and believing. And it reached all elements of society and life. And now there's another way, but there's so little room for any kind of dissent or nuance. And And I think a huge part of this, though, is our media. Our media is just so weak. We just don't have lots of different voices in the media saying different things. You know, the media seem to do the opposite of what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to hold power to account. You know, they're supposed to ask difficult questions and shine a light and make it uncomfortable for the people wielding power. But they don't do that in Ireland at all. You know, everything's managed. Everything's really tightly managed. So that's why it's so important to have podcasts like yours, to see independent media, because then people can just feel that they're not alone and realize that, like, I would argue the majority of people are completely opposed to gender self-ID once it's explained to them.
Yeah, and Laoise, what do you make of how parents should be dealing with what's going on with their children in this area? What that must be very distressing for parents looking at what's going on and being absolutely powerless about doing anything about it.
Like, I think, and this is true of parenting generally, I think parents need to not be scared of making their child unhappy, insofar as they don't need to be the child's best friend. In fact, they need to be the child's handrail. Because if this child is flailing around and unhappy and distressed, they don't need the parent to kind of grab onto the child's coattails and go with them. And that is the trans narrative. You know, the child leads you, the child tells you. What nonsense. That's not child safeguarding. That's not child safeguarding is adult led. It should be child centered, but it's always adult led.
Okay.
I think parents need to be very confident to say to their child in a loving way, no, you're not a girl, you're a boy. But if you want to, you know, whatever, try on your sister's tutu, of course, go for it. Like, there's a huge element of homophobia that underpins a lot of this that people don't talk about either. You know, telling an effeminate little boy who will probably grow up to be an effeminate gay man that's he's there for a girl is homophobic, you know. And I think that's why more and more gay men are getting involved in the cause, because they see that they too would have been trans themselves had they grown up in this time. But yeah, I think parents need to just have confidence in their parenting. They know their child more than anyone else. Like, all of the statistics show that there's a very clear linear pathway to identifying as trans. And by the time the child says to the parent, the teenager says to the mom or dad, I'm trans, this is my new name, they've been coached online. I mean, they've been online for like hundreds of hours. It's typically, as I said before, it's a reaction to some kind of trauma. And often, and this is one of the reasons that I felt compelled to campaign in this area as well, was that like around 90% of these teenagers will turn out to be same-sex attracted, so gay, straight, or bisexual. So I want to live in a world where they are encouraged to be themselves rather than trans.
Okay.
To me, it's the opposite of being of a liberal society, like forcing people into boxes based on their personalities.
And Marco, is this existent at all in Israel? Is it just at the surface, or is it even there at all?
No, it exists to a certain extent here. There is a less of a sense of disorientation, because Israel is a traditional society, notwithstanding its levels of tolerance. And, for example, homosexuals have basically the same rights as they have everywhere else. But basically, there is a strong religious core. So the sense of alienation doesn't exist, as you would see in many Western countries. I think it's also very important to underline an aspect of what we call freedom and liberty versus license. I think what we've seen is the collapse of the notion of liberty, which is predicated on moral constructs. And I think we've lost that in the West to a great extent. We veered towards license, which is very much a supermarket, a pick and choose of what you want to perceive yourself to be. So I think this is the great confusion that exists today in ostensibly liberal societies.
Okay, and we're going to move to the schools because, I want to particularly zone in on the school teacher Enoch Burke, because he has been portrayed as being the devil, if you like, in relation to this matter. That's my opinion. He's been portrayed as the devil by the left and the mainstream media, and essentially, this is what I think. Essentially, no matter what he's done in the court or anything like that, essentially, what it goes back to what he refused to do was to recognize and call someone by a different gender name, and that no matter when you get rid of all the noise, that's what the case is about.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion. I don't know what you think, Laoise. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. The substantive issue in that case is essentially the question is, can a teacher in Ireland today be forced to socially transition a child in their school? And if they refuse, can their employment be terminated? And unfortunately, that question has never been properly examined in any way in open court. And I would say that it's a shame that the way it's been handled on both sides, I think there's an element of vindictiveness to put a non-violent man who has, obviously is not a harm to society, to put him in prison in Mountjoy for, I think, 700 days by now. At the same time, as an officer of the court myself, I don't like how certain people think they can come to court constantly looking for relief, but still not respect that court. You can't have it both ways. You just can't have it both ways. So I can see the frustration on the side of the judiciary. And I feel the frustration as a campaigner, because I think it's such a good, strong case, and just get out of your own way. Like, yeah. There's no strategy being deployed. There's no tactics being deployed. Like, that case should have been tried. The substantive issue should have been looked at. I think he would have won.
How could he have got it to? Because I see what you're saying in relation to respecting the court and all of that, and I think that has overshadowed the real issue here in relation to the gem. How could he have done it differently, Laoise, in your opinion?
I mean, not breaking the court order.
But how could he have got it? How could he have got it into court to test it?
Well, like, the reason it's been delayed so much and he's ended up in prison was because he was found in contempt of court because he kept breaking the court order. But all that's totally a sidebar. That's nothing to do with the actual issue. Like, the real issue is the one I outlined, but it's also the employment issue, which is, it was escalated to the most extreme level. There's 4 levels, and that altercation, as it was with the headmistress, was deemed severe enough for him to be immediately suspended. That itself, I don't think that's even been tested. And I mean, that would appear to be also would look very good from his point of view. So I find that frustrating. I mean, in terms of how it could have played differently, I think they would have had a lot more support had the approach been less fundamental. I mean, I think it's fair to say there's a fundamentalism here, which clouds one's ability to perhaps look at this strategically. Like, when you come to court, and this happens all the time with lay people in court, they think it's about, if I just tell my story, then they're going to understand and believe me. But there's a whole, there's rules to the game, let's say, I mean, I've seen this myself. And when I was deviling, I was really, really fortunate to see a habeas corpus, which is an Article 40, which means habeas corpus, bring the prisoner. So you basically make an argument that someone has been unlawfully detained. And if you win, that person is immediately let out of prison. And these were lay litigants, they were activists. And, these people are really, they know the law. They come in with wheelbarrows full of binders, full of all the case law. They were exceptionally well read. But they didn't have the discipline to stop when they were ahead. They couldn't read the judge. I could see the judge had their sympathy. He was on their side. But then they kept going and going and going and going. And that's a discipline of advocacy. Advocacy is not just the argument. it's the discretionary ability to only choose the best argument, not weaken the best argument with a weak argument, and knowing when to stop and what not to say. And sometimes, you know, your client will be trying to get you to say this or say that, and you have to really make a judgment. Sometimes you will sort of say, I'm instructed to say this, whatever, but that is the job of a barrister, is to know what not to say and to know when to stop. And I think often with lay people, they don't see that element to it. You know, there's a huge amount of watching the judge and watching their micro expressions and knowing in real time. So yeah, I think a lot of things could be done differently. I think had they had representation, it would have gone a lot better for them. But equally, it's very hard to represent people who, you know, don't respect the court. But I guess from their point of view, they think it's incredibly biased and it's all a done deal, and the state's against them and they're being punished. And I can see that. I can see why they think that. But you see, you still have to believe, and I obviously do, as someone who upholds the court, that a good legal argument will win, and a good judge will, you know, will sit up if you make the right argument. And you'll get a fair outing. But and I don't know if they think like that. Do you know what I mean?
Has the Countess ever thought of approaching Enoch Burke?
Yeah, I mean, I bumped into them once outside the forecourts and asked, could I help them? But they're like, they don't really want to. They don't really want help. I mean, I know loads of people have tried to help them. Yeah, like, I mean, if I was them, I'd be on Joe Rogan. Like, I mean, there's loads of different ways to skin a cat. There's loads of ways to win an argument, you know? There's like the public opinion as well as the lawfare.
So in some ways they could be doing a disservice to the way they're carrying on. They could be doing a disservice to the country.
Well, it certainly helps the state to put forward the argument that anyone who is concerned about trans, they're just, you know, Christian fundamentalists who are homophobic. Like that helps the state, doesn't it? That helps the establishment.
It does, of course it does. Of course it does. Which brings us to the what is being taught in schools, because this man Enoch Burke wouldn't have been told to use these gender names or descriptions unless something was coming into the schools. And I see some parents are now trying to remove their children from certain what's the class that is taught
RSE, SPHE.
Here you go, SPHE. And they're trying to remove them. I mean, a lot of parents are not aware of exactly what's going on, are they, Alicia?
No, and you know, they've been kept in the dark on purpose. Like, their children are not allowed to bring their books home. The books are kept in school for a reason. And sometimes the books seem fine, but it's the resources that are used. It's the toolkits. It's the external resources. That's where the problems lie. There's a huge amount of reframing of what's happening. Successive ministers for justice, for education, have said, you know, that's not in the book. This is not what we're teaching. And then parents have found out that is what's happening. So that's one issue. The second issue is increasingly RSE, SPHE is, you know, like the concepts around transgenderism are being baked into the entire curriculum. So even if you wanted to try and remove your child, which is your constitutional right, you can't remove them fully from this indoctrination because it's happening all the time everywhere. Like, I've even seen a suggested lesson plan, which was history, and it was like about Joan of Arc, and the teacher was encouraged to say, Joan of Arc, was she a man, was she a woman? You know, was she transgender? This is the level of indoctrination. And in my time as an activist, so since 2020, I've seen the Trojan horse of bullying being used initially. So it was about stopping LGBT young people being bullied. Who can disagree with that? Nobody. You know, they shouldn't be bullied. But actually, it's a Trojan horse to force young people to accept it as truth. There's no alternative given. There's no, like, nobody. They're told about trans as if it's a fact. They're not told about it as if it's a system of belief. we've always said in the Countess, if they're going to teach trans ideology, they have to say some people think. They shouldn't present it as a biological fact or as a fact. Secondly, they have to talk about the detransitioners. This is the young people who typically, by the time they've matured, early 20s, they will decide, oh, after all, I was just a lesbian. I'm not a man. And they will quite often have done a lot of damage to their bodies. Like the testosterone is particularly egregious on the female body. So after about 3 months, you'll have back hair, chest hair, more male pattern baldness, and a male voice for the rest of your life as a young woman on testosterone. But the Cass Review, which was to this day is the largest ever independent systemic review of gender medicine for young people and gender services for young people, that said that even socially transitioning a child, which is exactly what Enoch Burke was asked to do when he was asked to use a different pronoun, that has no place in schools. What she said was that social transition is often seen as this kind of like harmless intervention, when in fact it's a really powerful psychological intervention. It has no place in schools. And already we've seen in the US, there have been successful cases brought by parents because the teachers and the school community transitioned their daughter behind their backs and didn't tell them. Now, I think in the King's Hospital case, if I'm not mistaken, the parents did know, or they said they didn't know, and then they did know. I don't know. As I've said before, it has never come out. We don't know really too much about the actual subject of that case because it hasn't come to court yet. But there is an idea, I think, that if we just let them cut their hair and wear different clothes and give them a new name, then sure, that's harmless, but it's not. And I think particularly with young children, we are disrupting a very fundamental, profoundly fundamental part of child development, which is when they realize at a certain age, by around 7, it's fixed, but from 3 onwards, it's very malleable. And so they genuinely believe if they take their like Action Man and put a dress in Action Man is a girl. So if you then tell that very young child, that 4-year-old or 5-year-old, that their best friend, Susan, no, Susan's a boy now. This is Sam. So, his name is Sam. He's a boy. Look, I think that is actually child abuse, because the people around them, the adults around them who that child trusts, are lying to the child. So in the Countess, we've always had compassion for the trans-identified child and the parents, but our lens is broader than that, and we look at all the children in that classroom. And I think it's very damaging to tell those children to not believe what their eyes tell them. But in terms of indoctrination, I have to say I've only got bad news in that regard, because it's gone from LGBT to now social justice, to creating these kind of social justice warriors. Critical race theory is now being baked into the curriculum, especially at senior level. But earlier and earlier, this idea that Irish people have white privilege, that we're all innately racist, and also climate. And with climate, I've even seen this with my own young children. And luckily over the years, I've been able to kind of bring them around or help them with it. But there's a huge amount of distress in young people because they've seen videos, or they've been shown videos of floods and what's going to happen. So I think there's a kind of a drive by the state that they know best, that they're going to educate our children on our behalf. That we're just in the way. We're getting in the way. We're in the way of their ability and their correct role to educate our children. And after all, that is completely unconstitutional, because under the Constitution, we are the primary educators of our children. But as I always say, when I talk about this in our campaigns, there's no good having rights that are amazing if they're only on paper. You have to invoke those rights, and parents in Ireland need to invoke those rights. But as you said, a lot of them they're not even aware.
Marco?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a question. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the principal at this school instructed Enoch Burke to refer to the child using certain pronouns. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And this brings to mind conceptions of rights, collective rights versus individual rights. And I think the balance is tilted to a great extent to individual rights as opposed to the rights of the collectivity. So in a sense, this is an imposition upon the collectivity. So unwittingly, in a certain way, they're forcing the collectivity to transition themselves. This is, I see, a sort of a perverse mechanism which is happening here. And what about the psychological distress that it causes to the collectivity being forced to use these pronouns instead of the traditional framework? Has this, because I think this is a very important aspect which has been a little bit neglected, imposing this upon the collective. What is the damage being caused to any of us being forced to address somebody with I of course regard it as a misplaced use of a pronoun. This, I don't think.
And also, it's not an equality movement anymore. It's a supremacy movement, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed.
And then when we look, Laoise, when we look at the headquarters of the main political parties, the people within them are all changing. They're all changing. A lot of them are in favor of this. They seem to be being able to convince the political masters, also the people in departments, in the government departments. It seems that ministers have ceded every single right that they had to these civil servants, and is that is a real concern, is it not? Because and shortly we're going to talk about where this is all going, but that's a serious concern, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, I think the decentralization of power for ministers has had a lot of unintended consequences. I think it was done, during the era of kind of Ray McSherry and brown paper envelopes. But what we now are left with, as you said, is civil service. Well, I think it's also timing, right? So that was done for kind of good, valid reasons. But then, unfortunately, I think around the time of Troika, there was a bit of a cull in the civil service. I think prior to that, they probably were quite nationalistic and old school. And now it seems to be peopled by young, bright things who are utterly ideological, who are happy for Ireland to be just a shop front for Europe, who don't see anything wrong with just rubber stamping and gold plating. In fact, all of these radical progressive policies and laws which have no connection to the values of Irish people, which traduce and transgress and trample on the constitutional rights of families and of parents. And it's only going in one direction. And then again, as you said as well, like, to dissent then is to be far right, I mean, like, for me, when I look at sort of the leading lights, the kind of the stars of politics today, like, a lot of them, I just feel like they definitely think they're doing politics because they think learning off the talking points off by heart that their SecGen, whoever it was, gave them, and saying it again and again and again in a media interview so that the broadcaster has to use that soundbite. They think that's politics. Like, there's no gap anymore between what the European Union, what the Commission say we should do and what we actually do. Like, in the past, people say we were a poor country with rich politicians, and now we're a rich country with poor politicians, because there doesn't seem to be any kind of rigor. There doesn't seem to be any, lobbying on behalf of Ireland. There doesn't seem to be any kind of sense of, we're in negotiations, we're going to get the best we can, then we're going to brief our media and brief our committees in Parliament. It seems to be the opposite. It's like they're foie gras geese and their feet are nailed to the floor, and they're just opening their beaks, ingesting this conveyor belt of legislation. And that's a systemic structural issue. And it's absolutely, as you said, down to the civil service running the show. Because, I mean, even if you did come in as a brilliant new minister, would you even be able to do what you wanted to do anyway? Would they all just cut the feet from under you? Like, I don't know. We don't know what's happening, do we, behind closed doors?
Yeah.
But we can assume that there's a lot of that happening, because there does seem to be an increasingly ideological current in government, and it's only going one way. Like, and I think that's also because of the historical aspect of Ireland not really having a right wing and a left wing historically. You know, our two main parties were birthed on whether or not you agreed with partition. So the parties of power have gone from being right wing to centre right to centrist to now left, and now I would argue hard left, because you're de facto hard left if you're bringing in radical gender self-ID and radical surrogacy laws. Like, our surrogacy laws are such that a single man in Ireland of 21 can commission a baby legally.
Yeah. So and let's use it as they use the right. The far left is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Now, and this seed of power as well has not only happened at government; it's happening at council level as well in the country, where councillors have very little say over what happens anymore. It's again, it's the officials in the council do it. So it's fed down. It's like a case. It seems to be like a case of the lunatics are running the asylum. That's what that's the best I can come up with in relation to how Ireland looks right now.
And then, you know, and you're absolutely right about councils. Like, councillors are, because I was on my local residents association, you know, and they would say openly, like, all they can do is canvass. Like, they just canvass the actual decision maker, which is madness. If you compare us to the rest of Europe, where local authorities are running schools and hospitals, they have huge budgets. Everything is decentralized and regionalized, and they are held to account as elected officials. You know, I think we've overcorrected in that regard, because of maybe there was a time of brown paper envelopes or whatever, but to the absolute detriment of our democracy and how it's run, because then who's accountable? It's like Children's Hospital. How do we still not know whose fault that was, you know?
Yeah. But Laoise, moving, we're getting into the final stages of it now, of this conversation. Where is all this going, Laoise, and can the brakes be put on, you know, with organizations like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that we need to mobilize a broad church conservative movement in Ireland. And by that, I mean, no purity, you know, spirals, no kind of, I'm wearing my identity like a Le Pen, you know, pin. If you're not my club, I'm not going to work with you. We need to build a coalition. And anyone who's moving the dial in the right direction should be on board. We need to be tactical. Nobody should be running against anyone else in the same, you know, election constituency. I think there's huge appetite for change in the next election, which will be the European and local elections. But we have to be organised in discipline leading up to that. Like what I do with the Countess, we're a think tank, so we're part of the ecosystem. What you're doing with independent media is part of it, but we do need more of that. So like we need to think of it in terms of we're up against 34,000 NGOs. So we need to think in terms of policy, like what we're going to put forward, policy alternatives, so that people who do feel unhappy with how things are going can lean into something that feels safe and you know, grown up and serious, you know. Then I think we need more and more media. People need to feel that the views that they hold are not extreme, they're not fringe, they're not far, certainly not far right, and actually they are the majority held views. And I think lastly, we have to get organised for the next electoral cycle, because as I think we've explained, it's only going one direction. It's actually only getting worse. I think for a long time, people were like, if we just give them what we want, they'll go away. No, that is not my experience in the last 6 years. It's getting worse and worse, actually.
But in the case of Ireland, Laoise, it seems like without the equivalent of a GB News or the equivalent of a not a far right, a right wing party, right of centre party, a proper right of centre party, because what we have at the moment in some of the right of centre parties is just lunatics in charge of them. That's my opinion. And that they don't really, they're just they don't really get it. Do you see? You're saying what needs to be done? Do you see a kind of a right of centre political movement, political party arriving in Ireland anytime soon?
I mean, the only real players are Independent Ireland and Aim 2. And I mean, if I had my way, they'd merge, you know?
And by the way, I didn't
If I
mean
had my
those.
way, they would merge and just like have a cohesive
By the way,
message.
and just to be clear, I didn't mean those two parties, because they are actually and certainly on the road to being what we need. There's no doubt.
Yeah, I mean, all the other small parties, like for me, I always say in the Countess is like Kate Moss, never explain, never complain. So for me, the first rule of politics is you don't air the dirty laundry in public. Like if your output, if you're broadcasting infighting, you're losing. You know, you've just lost the crowd, and that I see a lot of that. I can't even keep across it because I just don't have the appetite for it.
Well, they say in Ireland,
it just seems to be really helping the establishment, because it just seems like there's no discipline. It's factions and it's fractious, and there's no discipline, no strategy, no tactics. It's, you know, it's what kind of the left do, but the left have made it into a successful brand, which I call student union politics. Like, it's like there's no real seriousness to it. It's like, let's just come up with something, it'll sound good, you know. Like even the thing about leaving the European Union. Yeah, maybe there's an argument to be made for that, but it's just never going to sell. Like, I remember how it used to take 7 hours to get to Kerry. You know, the European Union built our motorways. Because we didn't have those motorways, we couldn't have heavy industry. Because of those motorways, big tech, big pharma are able to get their products out. Without these, you know, direct foreign investment, unfortunately, because of the lack of leadership in our country, we don't have a plan B. So nobody wants to go back to being a really backward, poor country, the poorest country in Europe. So like, I just don't see how you can sell leaving the European Union, even if there's a valid argument behind it.
Well, you certainly can't sell it if you can't discuss it.
Yeah, I know, but it's going back to my thing about don't weaken a strong argument with a
absolutely.
With a weak one.
I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying I'm saying it's not allowed to be discussed. And
it's very much outside the Overton window. You're absolutely right, because people just think that's crazy talk. You know what I mean?
And do you think these are kind of quick fire questions? So do you think that what the government is doing now in relation to the whole gender rights that they're giving people and all this, are they leaving it open to a massive payout by taxpayers in the future when someone actually does decide to test these things in the courts about their children being indoctrinated without the parents' permission or their knowledge? Do you think that we're leaving ourselves open for a major scandal down the road?
100%. I mean, they've already started in America, and where America, you know, goes, we follow. Like, I'd say, I mean, on the face of it, there would be a very strong case of parental rights, the infringement of parental rights as set out under the Constitution and under the Education Act. And that case probably will come to court, but I'd say even before that, we could have med-neg cases taken by detransitioners who were transitioned in this jurisdiction.
And Marco, just to you, it sounds to me that with the absence of religion in Ireland now, it's kind of gone. If it's not gone, but it's more or less been the church has become irrelevant in lots of cases. It sounds to me like the absence of religion has really mushroomed all this ideologies of different types and all that. Is that how you'd see it?
To a great extent, yes. I think the baby has been thrown out with the dirty bathwater. That is Ireland's problem to a great extent. People fail to understand is that people very often don't think that the very framework with which they judge the misdeeds of the church are the deeds which are very much within the teachings of the church itself, or within religion itself. So that is the moral framework whereby they judge the misdeeds of the church. And the church certainly has its faults, but of course It was also the creator of a great civilization, and Ireland was home to a great Catholic Christian civilization, which was exported to a great extent to the rest of Europe. During the Dark Ages, the barbarians arrived, and Christianity found refuge in Ireland, from where it spread to other countries. So I think Ireland is doing itself a great disservice by disconnecting from its Christian roots. And as I mentioned before, if people would only stop to think that they are judging the church by using the moral framework which they have inherited from Christianity. So it is a fickle way of going about things.
And finally, to you, Alicia, one can only hope that your successes in influencing public debate on this, and in relation to the referendums, and the joining of forces of people with common sense, with education, with a really opposite opinion on what's happening now, that they come together to create a movement that can go against, bring an alternative narrative to the people, and operate for real change. That's really what I suppose is what you'd like to see, Alicia, is it?
Look, I don't want to alarm anyone, but I think we don't have forever. There's a very short window here. We need to be really conscious of what sort of Ireland we want our children to grow up in, and our grandchildren. And that's what we should ask ourselves. Like, are we just an airport? Are we just a, processing center for refugees? Are we a nation of mongrels? Or do we have no culture of our own? Like, we talked about the referendum, but there's every data set whereby the Irish people are allowed to tell the government how they feel, whether that is the lack of a Conservative candidate for the presidential race on the ballot, where 200,000 people protested with their votes, whether that's the referendum where there was a landslide victory, the biggest ever in the history of the state, 74%, or whether that's the recent field protests where 40 different locations were brought to a standstill by hauliers and contractors and farmers. Like, the disconnect between the nation and the state has never been greater in Ireland. And I think that this is the moment that we need to realize that we all have to play a part and get really real, and get really serious really quickly. And we have to see change in the next electoral cycle.
Okay, we're going to leave it there and leave you with the last word on that, Alicia. Tonight, we've deliberately focused not on personalities, but on principles. How should a democratic society protect its children? How should governments respond when scientific evidence is still evolving? What role should parents play? Should Parliament, the courts, or clinicians determine the future direction of public policy? And how should taxpayers' money be used in this area? These are questions that affect families, schools, healthcare, the law, and society as a whole. Reasonable people will reach different conclusions. Our aim tonight has been to examine the arguments, consider the evidence, and encourage thoughtful discussion around grounded in law, public policy, and democratic accountability. My sincere thanks to our special guest, Laoise de Brún, and for her experience and sharing it. And thank you also to our regular guest, Marco Alexander, for joining us live from Jerusalem. And you were watching another edition of the GreenZone, updates from Jerusalem, and conversations with Eugene Doyle. If you enjoyed tonight's program, I'd ask you to please like, subscribe, and share with others. Until next Sunday at 7 p.m, good night, God bless, and thank you for watching the program tonight. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.